I'd love to tell this story because I want people to know about this. I mean, Chevron's whole goal in suing me is to silence me and to silence, more importantly, the indigenous peoples of Ecuador who are behind this whole thing. They don't want those voices heard because they interfere with their business model, which is based on extracting oil from really sensitive ecosystems where vulnerable people live, and it results in death and destruction, and they don't want people to know that.
If you've listened to this podcast, you know that we like to talk about the future. The word future is literally in the name of the show, and that's because talking about how the future could be better forces us to confront the present and what we need to do now to make that future a reality. So you might be surprised to hear that much of this episode is about the past. And I'm glad it is, because stories like the one you're about to hear shine a harsh light on the world we're living in, the forces we're up against, and the type of courage it takes to confront them. My guest today is Stephen Donziger, a former human rights lawyer who has spent the last several decades in a protracted legal battle with one of the most powerful corporations in the world, Chevron, after his involvement in suing Chevron on behalf of communities in Ecuador for the company's practice of dumping toxic waste into the Amazon rainforest. I say former lawyer because Donziger was disbarred after U.S. courts ruled that he engaged in misconduct during that case against Chevron. I'm very aware of that, and to me, it's still an honor to interview Stephen and share his story because I think that he's fundamentally in the right, and that he was targeted by a U.S. legal system that consistently protects the economic interests of corporations like Chevron above everything else. As you'll hear in the episode, Chevron caused real harm in Ecuador. Donziger took them on, and their response, years of legal warfare, professional destruction, and incarceration, was wildly disproportionate, and even worse, it sets a dangerous precedent for anyone who might want to take on corporate power in the future. We did this interview in the very apartment where Stephen spent more than 2.5 years on house arrest during his battle against Chevron. And if you stick around for the second half of the episode, you'll hear about how his story reflects on our current political landscape and how history may be repeating itself in a current legal ruling against Greenpeace. And of course, we'll also talk a lot about what you can do to help fight back. All right, let's get into it. Stephen.
Yeah, hi, good to see you.
Thank you so much for being with me today.
Pleasure.
Maybe we can start with where you started and maybe ground our conversation a little bit in your history and everything you've been through, starting with your long history of fighting the fossil fuel industry at an international level and putting up with quite a bit of abuse as a result of your advocacy, which has made you a bit of a legend in my book, to be honest. I'm very excited to be sitting here with you today.
Thank you.
But maybe, for our listeners who haven't heard that story, if you can go through a little bit of your history and how you got here.
Happy to be here and, really honored. And I love the work you do. So it's really fun to be here with you.
Thank you so much.
I mean, look, the world's really confusing right now. And I mean, to everyone, including myself, I mean, I'm 64 years old. I've been fighting for justice as a lawyer for, 30 plus years since I got out of law school. And I never thought we would evolve as a country to the point we're at now with Trump in power, with the rule of law under attack, with clear efforts to establish, dictatorial power by the President of the United States. That's what we're seeing right now. My personal story in doing this work, I think, is somewhat illustrative of sort of how things have evolved over the last several decades in this country. Like, this didn't just happen. I got involved, and I think what I'm probably most known for is my work in Ecuador. I've been to Ecuador over 250 times to try to help Amazon communities, including indigenous groups, deal with oil pollution caused by Chevron's systematic dumping of billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the rainforest and the rivers and streams that local communities were drinking out of. And this all happened in the 60s and 70s, 80s. I got involved in the early 90s as a young lawyer to try to do something about it. And, we put together a legal team, got resources, sued Chevron in the United States, and they moved it down to Ecuador. And ultimately, after 18 years of work, okay, we won, or I should say the communities with help with the lawyers won a record-breaking $20 billion pollution judgment. It's the largest environmental judgment ever to come out of a trial court in the world.
And that was basically finding Chevron guilty of dumping toxic waste in the Amazon. Okay.
Exactly.
And this is it's not just like an important ecosystem and natural environment, but it's also the homes of a lot of indigenous people who are getting their drinking water polluted and all of that, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, when I say the Amazon, I want people to understand what the Amazon is. The Amazon is a huge region of the world, that encompasses multiple countries, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Suriname, Guyana. It's a huge area that scientists call the lungs of the planet because of its importance to climate regulation, its
Right.
importance to the health of the planet. And it's populated historically mostly by indigenous peoples. And indigenous peoples, unlike us in the North, actually live, kind of in consonance with nature, with the natural world. And these are groups of people that do not have money as we know it, but they're not poor. They're actually quite prosperous because they live off the forest and they have all their needs met through the forest, the hunting, the fishing, materials to build their homes, plant life, animal life, the medicines, the natural medicines that come out of the forest. And until oil development hit this part of Ecuador, which is the part I'm most familiar with, there was no such thing as the word cancer in any of the vocabularies of the local indigenous groups.
Yeah.
And what happened was, in the 1960s, Texaco, now Chevron, went down there and built this system of oil extraction in a 1,500 square mile area that was engineered to pollute. Like the pollution problems in Ecuador, which are really grotesque. There's like 1,000 open air waste pits gouged out of the jungle floor. There's pipes in the sides of them that run the oil waste into rivers and streams that people drink out of and bathe in. And that's all part of a deliberate design. It's not like the Exxon Valdez or the Deepwater Horizon issue in the Gulf of Mexico. This was designed to pollute, and the people who did it knew full well when they did this that the end result will be what we're seeing today, which is a lot of people getting sick and dying from what happened.
So you showed up, young, hotshot lawyer, right? How old were you?
I was about 30 years old. Just so people know, like, I didn't go directly from college to law school. I was actually a journalist for 5 years, living in Central America, based in Nicaragua, covering the region. And then I did a couple other things before I went to law school. So I was like an older law student. So by the time I got out of law school, I was 30 years old.
Okay. Yeah. Well, younger than I am today. So you showed up in Ecuador, saw this pollution.
Yeah.
Imagine banded together with a bunch of legal comrades in Ecuador to sort of put together a case.
Yeah. In the early days of this situation, I was a very young lawyer working with more experienced lawyers and advocates. And we had a group of people and we decided to pool our resources and bring a lawsuit against Texaco initially, because they were the company that did this. They were later bought by Chevron, so everyone says Chevron. It's Chevron today, but at the time, it was just Texaco. We sued them in New York City, in federal court in New York, on the theory that they were located in New York, and the decisions that they had made to pollute in Ecuador were made in New York. So the actual tort, which is a civil term for essentially some form of wrongdoing, occurred in New York, and therefore we could establish jurisdiction over the pollution in Ecuador in a New York court. Now, the people in Ecuador who I represented didn't want to litigate in their home country because essentially Texaco had impunity in Ecuador. I mean, they literally had openly dumped billions of gallons of cancer-causing oil waste into the environment, and the worst penalty they received over decades was a $50 fine. Like, the courts were simply incapable of holding this company accountable in Ecuador. So we sued in the United States. And what did they do? Naturally, they fought for literally 10 years to try to move the case back down to Ecuador. We were fighting to get in the courthouse in New York. They wanted it in Ecuador, and they eventually won that part of the battle. And the case moved to Ecuador in 2001, where we had to then work more closely with Ecuadorian lawyers to continue the case under Ecuadorian law.
And why did Chevron have immunity in Ecuador? What was the deal there? Couldn't they be prosecuted for this by the local courts?
In theory, they could be, but it never seemed to happen. And I think it's because they had so much political power and so much economic power. There was no judge or no prosecutor or no lawyer that wanted to go up against them because they knew they would be overwhelmed and would have very little chance of winning. I remember one of my first trips down there, I met with this very prominent union leader. He was actually the head of the Union of Oil Workers in Ecuador. And I was talking to him. I was trying to get insight as an American about like the Ecuadorian judicial system. And I told him we were going to do this case. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, "You're never going to win this case in Ecuador." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because any judge that rules against Chevron knows he will be killed. That's what he told me.
Killed.
Okay. In other words, you couldn't go up against this powerful company. People need to understand, okay, Ecuador is a relatively small country. At the time, it had a population of about 12 million people. And Texaco was by far the biggest employer, creating the most wealth for the government. And no one felt they could go up against it and not be harmed or not lose their career or even their life. I mean, he said this to me, and I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
You must have feared for your life.
I started to think, is this kind of the fool's errand? Like,
is this worth it?
Like, are we going to spend a bunch of years and with no chance of success? But what I really learned from that conversation and talking to other people is that it was true that Ecuador was stuck, in terms of its deference to a foreign corporation. I mean, clearly the country was putting the interests of Texaco over the interests of its own citizens. Okay. So that's like a dynamic a lot you see in U.S. businesses that operate abroad. Still, and even more so now, actually.
Yeah.
But at the time, I'm like, well, we still have to fight this, because in any one case, you can overcome these dynamics with the right amount of organization, vision, resources, and I would say political organizing and really solid legal work. Okay. And I knew we could do it, but I also knew that for that to happen, I felt like Ecuador as a country needed to have some sort of energy shift. What do I mean by that? I felt like we needed, in addition to doing a lawsuit in Ecuador, we needed to change how people thought about the case and how people thought about the Amazon indigenous peoples. I noticed there was a massive amount of racism in Ecuador among the elites in Quito and Guayaquil, the two biggest cities. They would call the people in the Amazon the Amazonicas, okay, basically like the Indians and the savages. And that needed to change. And basically what we did is we ran a campaign in the country parallel with the legal case, where we basically explained to people, or tried our best to explain to people, that what Texaco, now Chevron, had done in Ecuador was an absolute grievous assault on the dignity and sovereignty of the entire nation. Yes, it manifested in the Amazon, but it wasn't just about the people who lived in the Amazon. It was the whole country. I mean, we would run tours of people, prominent people from Quito, the capital of Ecuador, down to the Amazon. These people had never traveled to the Amazon. They did not know what was happening. And little by little, I think we changed the narrative around the case in Ecuador such that the indigenous peoples who were bringing the case became heroes to most people in Ecuador for standing up for the entire country, not just for their own region. And we felt like that was an absolute necessity to deal with what this union leader was telling me. He goes, you can't win this case. We can win this case. But to win the case, we have to get the country to understand why these people were suing Chevron. And that in turn would lead to changes in the dynamics of the country such that judges could do their job properly. And most judges just, they want to do the right thing, but they also want to not offend too much. They want to get ahead in the country where they operate. So they sort of kowtow to the system of the country. And if the system of the country in Ecuador was completely pro-corporate, pro-oil, like he's right, we'd stand very little chance. But if it was more pro-indigenous, climate justice,
nature,
nature, we would actually might have a chance that a judge would do his or her job properly. That is, be neutral. I mean, we started, the judges, we were dealing with a legal system that was not neutral, it was pro-Chevron.
Right.
When we ended, we had a neutral legal system, and they were able to, in my opinion, look at the facts and the law and rule in favor of the communities. But it was a long battle. And by the way, when I went down there in 2001, when the case shifted to Ecuador, I thought, I'll work on this for a couple of years. Hopefully we'll win. And then I'll move on to the next case. And it took 10 years. I went to Ecuador every month for 20 years. Okay, I've been to Ecuador over 250 times to work with the local team and to make this happen. And ultimately we got there. But I mean, it was not easy. And as I spoke today to a group of law students, and, it's the law... anyone who thinks the law actually alone solves society's problems is really, really missing the point, okay? The law can help solve society's problems, But the law doesn't exist as its own thing. It's like in a broader political and social context. And if you don't understand the interrelationship between like what's going on politically and like how things play out in court, it's going to be hard to come up with the best optimal strategy to deal with these very powerful entities, especially when you're representing people who are historically marginalized and who have no money. I mean, our clients had no money. Can you imagine? Chevron had 60 law firms that they were spending literally hundreds of millions of dollars a year on to beat back these vulnerable communities that had no money. And one might ask, well, how the hell were these communities able to stay in the game? You know, which is a whole other piece of the puzzle, which I'm happy to talk about. But bottom line is, this is a great historical achievement, even though there's still a lot of work to do. I'm so proud to have been able to collaborate with these leaders to produce the result we've gotten so far.
And Ecuador is now a leading country in the sort of rights of nature movement, right? It seems like the culture shift that in some ways you played a role in. I'm sure, you know, there's so many people that wrote that story with you, but now they have a very strong record of protecting the rights of indigenous people and also nature itself.
Very true. And look, I want people to understand, you know, all societies are complex, right? Ecuador's got right-wing elements, left-wing elements, progressive elements, pro-nature elements, pro-extractive elements. But what's really, I find interesting about Ecuador is it's kind of up for grabs. Like you can really battle there and achieve things. You know, people should remember, too, that Ecuador has the Galapagos Islands off the Pacific coast of the country, which I think, you know, my analysis is between the Galapagos and the Amazon, there's a real sensibility in the country of wanting to respect nature and the natural world that you often don't get, like in the United States, to such a degree, you know. So there's something in the air there where I think people really want to help protect nature. So Ecuador has been at the forefront of a lot of leadership in the world. You know, first of all, the case. I mean, basically, it was in Ecuador that the world's most important environmental pollution case happened, which is our case. I mean, there's a lot of important cases. I'm not saying ours is more important than others, but it did produce the largest monetary judgment against an oil company ever from a trial.
How much was that?
It was ultimately it was $20 billion to begin with, then it got cut in half on appeal. $10 billion.
$10 billion.
With interest, it's now $12 or $13 billion.
And have they paid it?
They have not paid it. They've not paid it. That's a whole other aspect of the story. But it's alive. And they know they face risk from it, which is why they went after me and ultimately had me locked up for 993 days in this apartment, which we'll talk about in a second. But just to finish the point, Ecuador was the first country to write the rights of nature into its constitution. Mm-hmm. It produced the largest environmental judgment ever, you know, against an oil company. And its indigenous peoples continue to lead on a number of important issues around the world, including right now at COP30 in Brazil, like tons of indigenous peoples from Ecuador down there, you know, putting indigenous voices into the decision-making process. So Ecuador, it's sort of my second home. It's a country dear to my heart. I haven't been there in 6 years, by the way, because Chevron managed to get a judge to confiscate my passport. I've not left the country for many years. But I have great respect for Ecuador. Even just today, I should say this week, the voters went to the polls and rejected an effort by a new right-wing president to try to get the rights of nature out of the Constitution. And they rejected a measure to allow the U.S. military to build a foreign military base in Ecuador. There's a real progressive strain in Ecuador where when the people speak, you know, interesting things happen when it comes to the planet. It's fascinating.
So after you won the settlement, they came after you. Is it because they thought you were essential to this case, or was it vindictive? Were they just lashing out? And what was it like to have one of the largest corporations in the world trying to basically destroy you?
Great questions. Well, okay. So conceptually, they went after me, in my opinion, because I had become kind of instrumental in this whole process. So my first trip to Ecuador, I was like kind of a marginal player on the legal team. But over like 15, 20 years, I became essentially probably the main lawyer. And I organized all the fundraising. It took a lot of money to do this case. I helped organize the legal team. I helped organize a media strategy, a multi-pronged advocacy strategy. And I think that when Chevron looked at this whole landscape and they knew they were on the hook now for this enormous multi-billion-dollar judgment, they're like, how can we get out of it? Well, why don't we just sue the lawyer, Donziger, who works out of his apartment in New York? And I was not affiliated with a law firm other than my own. I mean, I was working with lots of law firms, but I didn't have my own law firm other than me and a couple of associates at the time. So I think they thought I was vulnerable, and they went after me and they sued me for $60 billion, which is the most amount of money any U.S. citizen's ever been sued for. I mean, you're laughing, and I have to tell you, that's
it's not funny. I'm laughing because it's so ridiculous.
No. I'm saying I kind of laughed too when it happened because like it's so absurd.
Yeah.
If you think about it, I mean, there's been no bank, corporate entity in the history of this country that's been sued for as much money as I've been sued for taking on an oil company successfully, as a human rights lawyer. So they decided that probably the easiest way not to pay the people of Ecuador that they poisoned was to sue me and like shift the narrative focus from the environmental crimes that we had proven that they had committed to the behavior of the lawyer, which they claimed I was a criminal. And they basically tried to criminalize me by suing me, claiming that the whole case we had worked on for like 18, 20 years by that point was a fraud. And the evidence, the so-called evidence they used, were a couple of things mainly, but they had signed a remediation agreement with Ecuador's government that had nothing to do with the private lawsuit we had brought against Chevron, but they did a separate settlement agreement with Ecuador's government, and they claimed because they had that agreement that our lawsuit was illegal and it was an attempt to extort money from them. But it was kind of preposterous on its face, and no one really accepted that. So then they claimed that I committed a crime by bribing the trial judge in Ecuador, and I reject that. It did not happen. There's no proof that ever happened other than a man to whom they paid $2 million and coached for 53 days to come up here and testify falsely that he was in a meeting where I supposedly approved the bribe of the trial judge in Ecuador, which is, again, completely false, and there's no evidence it happened other than this paid-for witness's testimony. The witness, his name's Alberto Guerra, later, after he testified against me, admitted under oath that he had lied in court in his testimony against me. I mean, it's a joke. And every court that's looked at this, other than this one U.S. judge who has investments in Chevron and is very pro-corporate, has totally rejected it, And our judgment that we won in Ecuador has been affirmed unanimously by Ecuador's Supreme Court, Ecuador's Constitutional Court, and also Canada's Supreme Court, where we went to try to enforce the judgment and force Chevron, really seize their assets in Canada to force them to comply with the Ecuador judgment. So they went after me ferociously as a way to distract attention from what they had done in Ecuador. And over time, it was hard to deal with. And
I can imagine.
There were times
stressful as hell.
I was scared, truly scared. My wife and son, we were like, where is this going? I actually thought they were going to, I knew from the beginning they wanted to put me in jail. And just so people know, they actually went to the U.S. attorney here in New York and tried to get me indicted. The U.S. attorney would not indict me, rejected their efforts, and that's when they sued me under civil RICO, which means it's a private lawsuit for money damages for the $60 billion. But they wrote up the lawsuit as if they were like prosecutors to make me look like a criminal. I had to deal with that for 2 or 3 years. I mean, and they got what they wanted in a sense, because it forced me, rather than spend my time and energy trying to get their money and calling them out, it forced me then to go into a defensive posture and defend myself, which is the whole purpose of a slap harassment lawsuit. It basically is intended to silence people. I mean, I think they wanted me to quit the case.
Yeah.
And I think they thought that would give them kind of a get out of jail free card had I done that. But there were times, especially when they first sued me, that I didn't really see a path, because I didn't really have money. I needed lawyers to deal with the literally hundreds of lawyers that were going after me. And I needed to keep my head on my shoulders. And I needed to be strong for my family and for my clients. It was by far the hardest challenge I've ever had to face in my life. But for a lot of reasons, most importantly, the solidarity of people who love me and people who care about the environment and saw the truth of what was happening. Due to that solidarity and support, like, we actually got stronger over time through the process. But there was a time where we felt very, very vulnerable and, really had a hard time sleeping. At the time, my son Matthew when they sued me, he was 5 years old. And he would sleep in our bed with us. And I remember, I'd often go to bed at 11 p.m. and 1 in the morning, I'm wide awake. They're sleeping and I'm wide awake and I can't fall back to sleep. I'm trying to.
There's so much pressure on you.
Pressure and trying to think through how I'm going to get out of it. What am I going to do tomorrow? And my son, of course, had no clue. He was 5 years old. And my wife, Laura, and I said from the beginning, we're not going to let a trauma turn into a pathology in our home. It's trauma, but we're going to be as normal as we can in the home. We're not going to talk about it all the time. We're going to create as normal, happy life and supportive life for our son as we could. So we were really conscious of the need to not let them get in our heads to such a degree that they would steal our happiness as a family. And I'm really proud of the way we handled it, but I'm telling you, it was tough. And I remember looking at my son on one of those sleepless nights, and I'm like, thank God he's so young, he doesn't know what's going on.
Yeah.
But I said, you better get your ass out of bed tomorrow morning and fight and do it in a dignified way, because someday he's going to Google you and he's going to know what happened. And I felt like I had a 5-year time frame before he would Google me. And I said, your son deserves a father he can be proud of. And how you handle this is going to determine whether that's going to happen or not. If you jump off the case, quit, lose your shit, that's not going to be good for anybody. So I having a son and a family really kind of made me even more determined to not let them do what they really wanted, which was essentially to make me feel bad about myself, destroy me, destroy the case, get me to quit, get me to mope. So it was tough as hell. And of course, several years later, they put me in detention and ultimately prison.
Because they won the case against you?
No, I'll tell you how that happened. But the initial lawsuit for $60 billion was just the first salvo of what became a 10, 12-year effort to bring me down. So, I had to get through that. That was tough. That's what I just described. And eventually we won this unanimous Supreme Court decision in Canada, and they were freaking out because Canada is a serious country with a seriously respected judicial system that was ruling in favor of us and the Ecuadorians, and sort of made their little RICO case against me with no jury look stupid, because Canada was this is a real case. So at that point, they launched a new strategy to get the U.S. trial judge, Lou Kaplan, who had ruled against me in this non-jury RICO case. Kaplan had undisclosed investments in Chevron, and it was just very, in my opinion, intellectually dishonest. I could use a worse word, but he just was not on the up and up, and he was not neutral. And he was very pro-Chevron, very pro the law firm that they hired. And ultimately, he charged you with, he ordered me to turn over my computer to Chevron's lawyers, which I can tell. I don't know how many of your viewers are lawyers, but no one does that. Lawyers, there's something called confidentiality, and lawyers do not give their case materials to their adversary lawyers.
Yeah.
I've never heard of such a thing. And he did that on the theory that because he had found I committed a crime in Ecuador, I didn't have attorney-client privilege. What he was really trying to do was destroy my relationship with my clients in Ecuador, who would have fired me in a minute had I turned over our confidential case file to Chevron. So I told the judge I wasn't going to do that, and to please hold me in civil contempt so I could appeal his, I think, blatantly illegal order. So eventually he held me in civil contempt. I appealed his order, and while I was appealing his order, he then charged me with criminal contempt of court, which is a misdemeanor offense on the grounds that I hadn't complied with his order while I was appealing it. This is crazy land. Never heard of such a thing. He had to refer that case to the U.S. attorney in Manhattan for prosecution. The U.S. attorney appointed by Trump refused to prosecute me. Refused it. The judge then appointed a private Chevron law firm to prosecute me in the name of the government. So I am the only person who has ever been targeted with a private corporate criminal prosecution in the history of this country. And that explains why I was locked up. Chevron's own lawyers took the prosecutorial machinery of the public and privatized it in the case against me and had me locked up pre-trial on a misdemeanor for 2 years and 2 months. I was sitting in this room mostly with an ankle bracelet. And they wanted to, again, they were so mad at me. And they wanted to, prevent me from traveling, immobilize my ability to move around and do my work. And they were trying to win. They'd already lost the case. They just didn't want to pay. And they knew I had to move around the world and talk to lawyers all over the world to get their assets, get courts to go after their assets to force them to pay the judgment. And that's why they wanted me here. And I haven't left the country for 6 years. But I mean, that's how I got locked up. So it's been this kind of 10, 12-year battle where they're trying to nullify my ability essentially to do my job, to be a lawyer. And, they're taking very extreme measures that I think are blatantly illegal.
Did they get you disbarred or get your law license revoked?
They did.
Wow.
That's a whole other aspect to it. I'm the first lawyer who has ever been disbarred. And, lawyers are licensed by their state. So in New York, where I live, I'm the first lawyer ever to be disbarred without a hearing based on a civil finding of fraud, without a jury. I mean, they wouldn't give me a hearing. They basically said what this judge found based on this paid-for witness testimony from Alberto Guerra is the factual finding that I am a fraudster, and they wouldn't give me a hearing to challenge what Kaplan had done because I had evidence to show, that this guy had admitted he lied, and they wouldn't let me bring it in. They wanted to apply a doctrine called collateral estoppel, which essentially means if a legal issue is decided, you can't relitigate it after. But that was preposterous because the whole case against me in the RICO case in New York was so flawed, and there were so many due process violations, and other courts in other countries had already issued rulings contradicting what Kaplan had found. So to disbar me without a hearing, based on that decision, to me was, again, just part of Chevron's politically motivated legal persecution of me. Yeah. But yes, I am disbarred, not because I did anything wrong, but because I did a lot right. I just want to be clear about that. And I'm going to soon launch a campaign to try to get my law license back.
Nice. Well, we're going to find a way to support that.
I appreciate that.
And before we're going to kind of move into the present and talk about how your past is so relevant now and how this strategy is being recycled to basically clamp down on not just the climate movement, but social progress around the world. But before we get into that, I just want to say thank you for fighting the good fight and getting through all of that.
I appreciate that. Hearing that, I want people to understand that when I started this legal work in Ecuador, I never imagined it would be this. I really thought I was naive. I really thought the legal system would work as I had been taught in law school. Went to Harvard Law School with Obama, by the way. He was in my class, Barack Obama. And I just thought this is what I wanted to do. I didn't know that if you were a little too successful in taking on these powerful interests, this blowback could be so corrupt is really what it was. Yeah. But thank you for saying that. I feel a little bit like the accidental environmental lawyer. I never thought I'd be an environmental lawyer. I just wanted to do social justice work. Fell into this case, fought our asses off, won the case. And by this point, Chevron was so freaked out by our success, they hired, again, dozens of law firms. 2,000 lawyers have worked on this case for Chevron since its inception. 2,000 lawyers, okay? It's probably the most litigated case ever. I just think they've spent probably $2-3 billion in legal fees trying to stop us.
So much money.
So it's become this thing, and I'm super honored to be able to be involved in it and to understand what the communities down there accomplish and to tell this story. I love to tell this story because I want people to know about this. Chevron's whole goal in suing me is to silence me and to silence, more importantly, the indigenous peoples of Ecuador who are behind this whole thing. They don't want those voices heard because they interfere with their business model, which is based on extracting oil from really, sensitive ecosystems where vulnerable people live, and it results in death and destruction. And they don't want people to know that. So they don't want me talking about this. They don't want the people of Ecuador talking about it. So to have the opportunity to, be on your podcast is really important to us and to our to my clients, and super honored to be able to do it.
Well, unfortunately,
Yeah.
this playbook that Chevron used against you is still being used.
Mm-hmm.
Something that's come up recently is a massive trial against Greenpeace. Greenpeace USA, one of the leading climate activist organizations in the country, has been hit by a slap suit as well. And the verdict came back, they were found guilty in a little courthouse in an oil town.
In North Dakota.
In North Dakota.
Yeah.
And now the whole organization of Greenpeace, the whole institution of Greenpeace in the USA is at risk. Can you tell us a little bit about what that verdict means and how it reminds you of what you've been through?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, just so people know, if you don't know, Greenpeace, I'm older than probably most of the people watching this podcast, but when I was growing up as a kid, like in the 1970s, Greenpeace was the group, the environmental group in the world. And they still have chapters in 25 countries. I mean, this is like prior to the internet. I know you probably can't imagine this, but in the old days, the way people got news is like, there'd be like a still photo taken and it'll be published in some newspaper. Like by the AP, it'd go out on the wire. And in the 1970s, there was this big problem with whaling in the North Pacific, where these huge Russian industrial-sized boats would go out in the North Pacific and they'd harpoon whales and, suck them into the boat and then, do whatever they did with them. And they'd just be killing whale after whale. And Greenpeace bought a boat and like sailed right out into the middle of the North Pacific with like 20 activists. And they had these Zodiac little rafts, motorized rafts off the main boat. And they would, like 4 or 5 of them would go in these little Zodiacs and get in the way of these big industrialized ships. I mean, it's freezing cold out in the middle of the ocean, and block them from harpooning the whales.
It's badass.
And there was a famous picture of this happening that a photographer took, I guess AP photographer was on the boat, and it got all over the world. I mean, Greenpeace became famous overnight, like as the most creative, effective environmental group in the world. And even though there's a lot of other creative groups that have come up since, Greenpeace is still powerful and they're really important, and they operate in 25 countries all over the world. And the fossil fuel industry is now trying to destroy Greenpeace as a way to try to intimidate the entire climate movement.
Because Greenpeace has been a thorn in their side for decades.
Exactly. So, the particular case concerned the Standing Rock protests in 2016 against the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is being built across North Dakota by a company called Energy Transfer. The owner of Energy Transfer is a billionaire named Kelsey Warren, who's a close friend of Trump. These are all Texas oil people who they basically make their money by plundering the planet. So Kelsey decided to sue Greenpeace on the theory that they had interfered. They had a few staff members at these protests at Standing Rock, and they had interfered with the construction of the pipeline. It was all BS. And they managed to get this harassment lawsuit into the courts of North Dakota, and they forced Greenpeace to defend itself in what I believe is an extremely unfair, if not rigged trial. Like, I was out there, and every member of the jury, other than 2, had direct ties to the fossil fuel industry. It's a very fossil fuel industry county. It's a pro-Trump county where this trial was held in North Dakota, and Greenpeace just got screwed. So I've been...
And the verdict was for how much money?
$669 million.
They keep coming up with these crazy numbers.
It's all crazy numbers.
You're like 669, that's nothing. I got sued for $6 billion.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
But 669, to be clear, it's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money.
Enough to take down Greenpeace USA.
Easily. So it's under appeal now. And me and other lawyers and advocates formed a team to monitor the trial and report on it. And we've already sent a letter to the United Nations asking for an investigation.
Good.
Big picture, though, is the same law firm that Chevron hired to go after me in that private prosecution and in this RICO case, the same law firm was hired by Energy Transfer and this billionaire Trump friend Kelsey Warren to go after Greenpeace. This law firm specializes in selling its legal services to essentially attack the First Amendment rights of advocates like me and groups like Greenpeace. And we've been calling it out. They're now threatening to sue me again for defamation because I called the trial in North Dakota rigged. It is my opinion based on evidence that I've seen. I do believe Greenpeace did not get a fair trial and that it was rigged. It just wasn't a fair shake. So they're just on a rampage. And these lawsuits threaten freedom. I mean, they threaten our ability to advocate. And the fossil fuel industry, I think, knows their time is up. I mean, they know the planet is reaching the breaking point, the point of no return. They know public opinion against them is growing, and they're doing everything they can to keep their pollution party going for as long as possible. And one of the methods they use is just to sue people in these fake cases that create such enormous burdens. I mean, I described like those sleepless nights and how am I going to get money when I got sued? Greenpeace has more money than I had then, but it's still such a burden they literally could go out of business and we'll lose one of the most storied environmental groups ever. So, I would say this whole effort to criminalize advocacy in the climate space in particular is growing in the United States. It's not just here, but in the UK and parts of Europe and Australia. It's very dangerous. And
it's super dangerous.
It's a typical, not unexpected response by an industry that will stoop to anything just to maintain its privileges, power, and profits.
They sent you a letter, right? Because they think that it sounds like you've gotten under their skin and they think that your trial monitoring efforts are probably working. And so they told you to basically delete all your posts about the trial being rigged.
Yeah, that's true. They told me to take down all my social media posts or risk being sued, but I'm not going to take them down because I believe they're based on evidence. I believe they're true. Truth, by the way, is a total defense to defamation. So, I mean, if they want to sue me, we'll go down that route, and see how that plays out. I'm not going to be intimidated by them. And, I believe that the evidence will show that the trial against Greenpeace was really unfair. And I don't believe this very large verdict against Greenpeace is going to hold up on appeal. I think it's going to be reversed.
Well, you have an opportunity right now if you want to redact your statements and apologize.
Listen, I think people should double down and go to my Instagram and my social media platforms and read those statements.
Hell yeah.
Because, man, and look, in all seriousness, like the way you deal with these harassment lawsuits is you can't run from them. You got to lean into them.
Yeah.
Call them out publicly and try to flip the script.
Right.
They want us to run away. We got to run into the fire and like flip it around. So they're the ones that feel the heat, and it's like, all these clashes between police and protesters. How many times have you seen a cop inappropriately throwing a tear gas canister, in the middle of a protest? You're seeing this all the time now with ICE. And someone picks it up and throws it right back at them, so they have to deal with their own tear gas. And it's sort of an analogy for how you have to deal with these harassment things. You cannot take it. You've got to flip the script and make them feel pressure and feel the heat. And I think we're seeing that a lot now in the United States with like the invasion of ICE and the National Guard into some of our cities. Like there is active resistance happening in the United States. It's very encouraging right now.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's the best of times and the worst of times in a lot of ways, right? Because the resistance is so active because it needs to be.
Yeah.
And, you've talked a lot about the ways in which during the Trump administration, the climate movement is being punished, is being targeted. The courts are being weaponized against activism in general. How do you make sense of the ways that the law is being weaponized against social movements in the Trump era? And what can we do about it?
First of all, this isn't just happening in the last months or few years. I mean, I've been watching an increasing sort of reactionary, kind of dynamic take hold in our federal courts over my entire lifetime. This has been documented in a couple of books. One's called The Scheme by Sheldon Whitehouse, the senator. He really nailed how the Federalist Society and the Koch brothers and all these extreme right-wing funders funded efforts that have taken over our federal court system to a great degree. And certainly our Supreme Court is completely under the control of this effort. And I believe we're in a very perilous situation in the country in that we really don't have an opposition party to Trump. I mean, the Democratic Party has been so weakened and so sort of hollowed out by corporate interests, by the flow of money into politics, that it was completely complicit in what every genocide scholar in the world believes was the Israeli genocide against the people of Palestine and Gaza. And that's the Democratic Party. And the Republican Party...
That's the resistance
That's the
party.
resistance. And, we've seen this time and again with the government shutdown. I mean, there was an opportunity back in April when the Schumer-led party could have not cut a deal with Trump, which just simply enabled him more and more to violate the law. These people don't operate by the rules. They don't care about the law. They operate in bad faith, and you cannot do deals with them. You have to really fight them tooth and nail to help bring them down. And I think we don't really have a resistance party in this country. What's the point? There's a lot of energy in this country to do something about Trump. There's a lack of a vehicle to harness that energy in an organized way to gain political power. I mean, we've seen an example of what could be done here in New York City with the election of Zoran Mandami. Okay.
Yeah.
So can that happen on a national scale? I actually think it can if we had the vehicle. So it's super frustrating to watch people like Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries and Nancy Pelosi. I mean, they just need to get out of the way. They've never really resisted. They're not really of the people, of the streets, of the working people. They essentially represent just another facet of the corporate class, which is why we have no real party. I mean, where's the resistance to Trump? Where's the national strike, the general strike, which you would see in any European country?
Oh, yeah.
And it will come out of the labor movement. But since the degree of membership in labor unions in this country is now so low, it's like 7% in the private sector. In most European countries, it's 60, 70, 80%. There's no way to mobilize people to hit the streets. So everything's become either directly corporatized or sort of so influenced by corporate power. There's very little to work with. And, so when a would-be fascist like Trump, and I believe he's a fascist in his heart and how he thinks. I'm just watching how he thinks and acts. When that kind of person takes power and does these outrageous things that we've seen over the last 6 or 8 months in this country, there's very little to work with when there's no opposition party. And it's been exacerbated by the fact that our federal courts are essentially, certainly the Supreme Court is now a political arm of the Trump movement. It is not a court. Okay. Courts don't function like that court functions. It's not a court. It's a political tool under the guise of the judiciary. And then, of course, the Congress is supine because the Republicans won't resist Trump, although we're seeing a little bit of stuff happening over the Epstein files. But man, I mean, there's no real opposition. Trump has complete unchecked authority now in this country, and we're in a very dangerous spot because of that. And our Democratic Party simply doesn't know how to resist it. And I don't know what to do about it. I really don't. I mean, thought of maybe running for office myself in all seriousness, but like the structures are such that you just can't, it's very hard for people like Zoran, what he did in New York, to replicate on a national scale because the party structures are designed to keep voices like that out of the discussion.
Yeah, I mean, something that I've noticed you doing more recently, which I've appreciated, and that I've also started doing more, is like actually endorsing candidates who are on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party in an effort to transform the party into something that could actually be a resistance party. I think if we do that, we have to do that with one hand, and with the other hand also try and figure out how do we build some sort of third party power or some sort of parliamentary movement within the country, because we can't put all of our faith in the Democrats. That's become very clear. But they do have a lot of power. They have been in charge recently, and we can get good people into that system. So to you, what is the role of electoral politics, and what's the role of a potential third party? What is your maybe opinion on how to move forward?
So I'm a real open tent guy. I mean, I believe all of these spaces should be utilized to the extent possible. So I'm not turning my back on the Democratic Party. That's a massive party with a huge infrastructure. We should take it over.
Absolutely.
And transform it into something that serves working people.
Yes.
And progressive interests. Okay, that's the challenge with that party. But we also need to create other structures outside the two-party system so we can create a real democracy in this country. I don't believe we have a real democracy. I mean, voting once every 4 years for two corporate parties is not a democracy. Apologies to our founding fathers, okay, who designed this democracy at a time only white male property owners could vote. Women couldn't vote. And there was a genocide being committed against indigenous peoples. And we lived in an apartheid country with segregationist laws. But what do? Build power. People have so much more power than they realize. And it's funny because I truly believe, like what happened to me in the Chevron case, an example, they want to try to convince me and anyone who would even think about working with me on this case that it's futile. They want us to believe we don't have the ability to do this. They want people not to do the work. They want people to look at me, having gone to detention for 993 days, including 45 days in Danbury, a federal prison in Connecticut. They want people to look at that and say, I'm not going there. I don't want to do that work. It's too dangerous. The attack on Greenpeace. They don't want people to do environmental justice work. There's an attack now on a woman named Zoe Rosenberg. She's a senior at UC Berkeley who rescued 4 chickens from a slaughterhouse in Sonoma County, California, and she's facing 5 years in prison.
What?
And she's had an ankle bracelet on for 2 years. She has a sentencing December 3rd. I mean, one thing I've sort of tried to do, given what happened to me, is follow these cases. There's a lot of little cases like this that nobody hears about, where the system, the legal system comes down to crush people. But look, is it really about Zoe or is it really about Steve Donziger? It's actually really about intimidating everyone else who's thinking about doing the work because they want to weaken our movement so they can continue to gain more and more power. So we have to really be smart, organize together, build our union base, build our social groups. And as you point out, we need a multi-party democracy. I mean, when you only have 2 parties and they're both of the corporate ilk, like, how do you get a new idea to get into the body politic? It's very hard. I'd say it's almost impossible. We need a multi-party system because without it, it's very difficult for innovative ideas to gain enough of a foothold to get into the Congress such that coalitions can be built and these ideas can become reality or have a chance of becoming reality. And we need a multi-party democracy in the United States. We need more than 2 parties. I'm not saying turn your back on the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party works hand in glove with the Republican Party to prevent other parties from rising up such that they can actually win seats in the National Congress. And, the Democratic Party is a huge challenge in the way of the advancement of social justice in this country. The Republican Party is lost. I mean, they're the Trump party now. They're a cult party. So we really, even when the 2-party system functioned more traditionally, like when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, there were debates and ideas and things were getting done. Not perfect, obviously, but things were getting done. Now it's just complete paralysis and the elites, the oligarchs, the billionaires, the wealthy part of our country sort of hold sway.
It's the capture of a political system by capital, right?
It is. And it's not just, I have to say, it first started with the Congress, where basically money was flowing into congressional races. And then all of that became a flood after the Citizens United decision, which I think was in 2012, that really undermined democracy, such that now I would argue that all 3 branches of government are captured. I mean, it used to be at least the judiciary would kind of hold the line against a lot of this craziness. But now that the Supreme Court is all MAGA, there's no check on presidential power. And it's just so interesting to me how the Supreme Court gives Trump everything he wants, and when Biden was in power, they gave him virtually nothing. It's a political court, and that needs to change too, and there's many proposals out about how to change that, but this whole system is now completely dysfunctional. The system of liberal democracy as designed in the United States has failed. And I'll point this out because I've studied Germany in the 1930s. It feels like some in the Trump crowd, like Stephen Miller and some of these people, actually studied what Hitler did and are borrowing a lot of the techniques. And I'll remind people, Hitler never took power through a coup. People need to understand that. Hitler convinced the Reichstag, the German parliament, to vote him the power to rule by decree. Hitler used the tools of democracy to destroy democracy in 53 days after he was named chancellor. 53 days.
It's quick.
And then all the violence in the concentration camps and the Holocaust happened out of that. And I think we're not in a dissimilar situation right now where, our Supreme Court is giving Trump these powers.
It's a reason, I think, to not a reason not to walk away from the Democratic Party, because from a power dynamic perspective, they are necessary to hold the line against some sort of absolute authority being voted over to President Trump. I think the other reason is glimmers of hope we're seeing of very progressive candidates like Zoran Mamdani, who you mentioned, getting power within the Democratic Party and then seeming to build some sort of momentum towards it, transforming it back to a party that actually works for people. People who effectively have socialist views, who believe that the government should work for the betterment of society, not for the accumulation of profit, are the folks who I think can steer the party back in a better direction, which is why I really appreciate that he's stood firm on his democratic socialist sort of branding, because obviously that word has a ton of baggage, especially in a country that went through the Red Scare where there was all of the CIA propaganda against it. But so it's hard to win on that word. But the fact that he did makes me think, oh, hey, maybe there's like more room for some sort of transformation within the party than
true.
we thought.
But getting back to your earlier point about like the need for kind of a European-style multi-party democracy in the United States.
Which I still think we need, by the way. I'm not trying to say let's work with the Democrats.
I'm not disagreeing with anything you're saying. We got to strengthen the Democratic Party, make it more responsive to the needs of the majority. But Zoran's views, his platform, in the context of Western Europe would be completely mainstream and even modest. He's a capitalist, okay? Bernie Sanders called himself a socialist in his presidential campaigns. He's a capitalist of sort of the Northern European variety, higher taxes,
social democrat,
safety net. But he's not what does it mean to be a socialist? These are actually just labels, and they're labels that, the media and the powers that be in America use to try to marginalize people and distort what people actually think and believe and they're advocating for. So Bernie Sanders to me should never have called himself a socialist. Bernie should have been like, I'm for capitalism with a human face. I'm for fair capitalism, not I'm a socialist. So, given the decades and decades of propaganda in this country about communism and socialism, like people, it's traumatic for people to think someone's a socialist. So I recommend staying away from the labels and really focusing on what are the policies people are proposing.
Right. And I think ultimately what we're looking for is someone who's willing to admit that power needs to be taken from certain people in order to be given to the majority of people, right?
That's exactly right.
There's specific people, corporations and individual or very rich people who have too much power, and we need to actually reduce their power, which means taxing them. It means bringing democracy into more decision making, and it also means, I think, reorienting economic incentives towards actually delivering well-being to people as opposed to accumulation of profit.
That's exactly right. And
if you want to call it socialism, I'm cool with that. Some people may not be.
Call it what you want, but what you're really talking about is trying to, use our policies and our tax system to create a more just society where everyone has a fair shot.
Right.
We don't have that right now. When half the country is living paycheck to paycheck and can't even think straight. Can't think straight enough, doesn't have the bandwidth in their own head.
Because they're in debt.
Or lives to even go protest this guy.
Right.
Which is how they want it.
Yeah.
They want people desperate. They want people, on edge. They want people to not have health care or to stress about health care because the stress benefits those who want to take more and more for themselves. I spent a lot of time in Canada and Europe. In these countries with a good national health plan, you don't see this level of stress.
No.
That's a huge stressor.
People seem way more
America,
chilled out. Yeah. Things are kind of grim. But one thing you mentioned earlier is that you have a lot of hope seeing the resistance movements popping up. And I'm curious, what's giving you hope right now?
Well, I'm a deep optimist. We have a lot of power, and there's a lot of people who want to help make this world a better place. I've seen this my whole life, but I really feel it now. And there's evidence of it all over the place. The No Kings protests, the tour that Bernie and AOC took, massive turnout, the recent election results where Trump just got, whacked. I think it's, the Epstein, I just feel like things are shifting. And I think there's going to be a real backlash to Trump. And the question is, how's that going to look? How's it going to manifest? And there's going to be, when that starts to really pick up steam, there's going to be an effort by the traditional two-party system to capture it, funnel it into like this structure that hasn't served the people, rather than trying to take that energy and build something new, like what's happening here in New York with Zoran. Okay. Yeah. And I think the real question as this shift begins to really pick up is, what is it going to be? Right. I mean, I think the opportunity's there. Who's going to grab it? And in what direction is that thing going to move? Is it going to move toward real progressive politics? Is it going to move toward real democracy? Are we going to like correct our problems with our Congress court system, these awful legal decisions? Or are we going to just do more of the same? Because right now the system is so rigged and tilted in favor of the elites. It's very hard to get measures through on a national level that actually help working people. But I'm optimistic the opportunity is here. It's actually here right now. And the question is, how do we harness the energy and where do we put it? I mean, I will say this about Bernie and AOC's tour, if you think about it. You know, they were getting huge crowds, 30, 40, 50,000 people. But at the end of those rallies, there was
an action
energy
to take.
generated.
Yeah.
But what happened?
Right.
Like, what's there to do? And crazy. I mean, I'm betraying my age, but like, I remember when Jesse Jackson ran for president in 1984, ran in the Democratic primary. It was very powerful. You know, he was really an incredibly viable candidate. He built a coalition. They called it the Rainbow Coalition, people from all different backgrounds and, you know, ethnic backgrounds, racial backgrounds, political backgrounds, men, women. And when he had to drop out of the race, like all of that energy had been used to organize support for his campaign just sort of faded out. You see this, I think we saw this with Barack Obama in 2008, like that incredible coalition that he put together ended up dissipating. And I think we've seen it also to an extent with Bernie in the 2016 and 2020 campaigns. Like, where's that whole movement?
Yeah.
And I think what ends up happening is it's all just funneled back into the Democratic Party, which slowly over time becomes more, you know, eroded in terms of its support for working people. So people get frustrated, they drop out, or they have nowhere to go. They don't get enthusiastic. So I believe, again, the opportunity is here. And the question is, you know, how do we generate the energy? And once generated, harness it toward a vehicle that can take political power and implement real policy changes that this country needs. And, you know, to me, that's the real challenge right now.
Are there any examples in your life, especially in the US, but anywhere globally, where you've seen this energy harnessed in the right way that you'd love to point to as a historical example of real action being taken as a result of political momentum and energy?
Well, you know, there's lots of examples in history, you know, but I mean, if you look at certain revolutionary movements that took power and did a lot of good things, I mean, look, people have different views about Cuba, but you cannot deny that Fidel Castro, I mean, this is a great example of sort of how one person or small group of people can effectuate significant change on a mass scale. Batista, U.S.-backed Batista, had an army of 60,000 people, when Fidel and his Che and about 100 other dudes were on like a motorboat, landed in southern Cuba in 1954, and were immediately shot up. And they lost half of them, right, like when they landed in Santiago de Cuba, and then 60 of them went up in the mountains to try to build a guerrilla movement to overthrow Batista, who had, again, an army of 60,000 people. So how the hell in 6 years did these 60 people organize a movement that defeated an army of 60,000 people in 6 years? So I'm not saying that's appropriate for the United States, like go into the hills and take up arms. I'm not saying that at all. I'm simply pointing out that a few people properly organized with enough clarity and tenacity, when the conditions are right, can really effectuate great change very quickly. That's not part of our education. Like, we don't study these things in school. I think there's a concerted effort to hide information from people that would empower them to visualize what they could really do and visualize the power that they really have. And I'd say in this country, like, look at a guy like Ralph Nader. I mean, a lot of people don't even know who this guy is now. He's in his 80s, but Ralph Nader did more to help consumers in this country, like working people, than just about anybody. He got out of law school in the mid-late 60s and built a group called Public Citizen. And there's all sorts of, the EPA, all sorts of regulatory agencies exist because of the work Ralph Nader and his movement did in the 70s. Again, an example of how a small group of people can, with a proper vision, can, really effectuate significant fundamental change. And I'll tell you, I used to live in Nicaragua. My first job when I got out of college, I was a reporter for United Press International, and I eventually moved to Managua, where I ran the bureau down there with a Nicaraguan man for a year or two. Nicaragua is another good example in that, ruled again by a U.S.-backed dictator for decades. A bunch of young people organized, and they overthrew Somoza and his army in 1979, took power, had probably the world's most successful literacy campaign ever, really shifted things in that country. In the United States, under the presidency of Ronald Reagan, started to fund the Contra war to undermine that government. But they made it happen, but it's very difficult to sustain these kinds of things in the face of U.S. power, because the United States government, purports to support democracy and human rights as part of our foreign policy. Obviously, it doesn't. People are more onto that now. But when I was growing up, that was what was talked about, right?
Yeah.
But any country that tried to have a different concept of what that was, one that was based more in socialism and, in worker control, was attacked by the United States. I mean, Cuba has been under a U.S. economic embargo now since 1960. Okay, that's 60 plus years. Nicaragua was attacked with a Contra war when the Sandinistas took power. And I've been to these places, and, what we're told about them is very distorted. I'm not saying they're perfect societies, by the way, but it's very distorted, sort of how they're portrayed in the U.S. media. But I will say that there are a lot of examples of significant change happening. It's possible. And the first battle is to believe it could happen, understand what you need to do to make it happen. That's one of the reasons I'm so excited about, Zoran, and also Katie Wilson in Seattle is another person who just got elected mayor. She's a Democratic Socialist. People are hungry. They're really hungry for this kind of thing right now. People need to step up, take that step, run for office and start making stuff happen.
Yeah, I was wondering if there's an action you would encourage listeners to take that want to get involved, that want to do something. Is it run for office? Is it join a campaign? Is it, is there something that you want to see more?
Well, I would love to say there's a really viable third party that people should join now as a way to take power. I mean, we do have third parties. The Green Party, Jill Stein.
And the Working Families Party is actually pretty cool.
Working Families Party in New York,
I like their work
really
a lot.
Strong. So look at those options. And also, I think a lot of what people should do, in my opinion, is start in your community and figure out what you can do there. How's your school board constituted? How's your city council constituted? Who's the mayor?
Right.
And build power at the local level, like we've done here in New York, to really shift things, and like it's being done in Seattle.
Yeah. And
actually in a lot of cities. So I think people, there's opportunity everywhere. And people need to get involved. I mean, look, people can either shape politics or have politics shape them. It's very fundamental, right?
Yeah.
Shape it, get out there and do what you can. And, also the other advice I give, and I just spoke to a bunch of law students today, and I said, it's important people take care of themselves when they do the work.
Right.
There's a lot of need out there, but it doesn't mean you have to sacrifice so much that you can't even, you're worried about where your next meal is going to come from. Try to create a life of basic security. You'll be more effective at the work if you have the opportunity, obviously. But of course, the purpose of all of this is to allow people to have the material conditions of life and the mental space to be happy. I mean, isn't that the whole point of this?
I think that's the whole point.
To love.
That's
to
why
politics.
That's why I'm political. Is because I think everyone deserves.
It's not because you want power.
A good life.
To create conditions so everyone can enjoy the fruits of our society and be happy. And that ain't happening right now.
I'm glad you mentioned getting involved in the local political level, because something about the third party politics conversation that frankly annoys me right now is these parties only really become part of the conversation when we have a presidential election.
Yeah.
And it's a third party is not going to win a presidential election in the United States given the current state of affairs. But they could win a mayoral election.
yeah.
They could win a city council election.
Yeah.
Like, I would love to see the Green Party, Working Families Party. Working Families Party actually is doing a really cool thing of kind of like finding ways to get really progressive candidates to run as Democrats backed by the Working Families Party.
Yeah.
It's a very cool model that I definitely recommend people check out. But if, I think I like the idea of the Green Party. I would love to see the Green Party like taking over my city council, taking over like the school boards in my local area, but we just get their like presidential candidate. And it's like, that's like the last office to take over, right? So just wanted that had a small bone to pick there. But I do think that third party politics starts at the local level. That's how movements get built, is like through local politics first. But I was also gonna laugh because this idea of taking care of yourself first and making sure that you can survive before you try and do the fight is a little bit ironic coming from you, Steve. Isn't it? You're kind of like,
well, it's a lesson I learned from their own life. I mean, right? I mean, yes, it is ironic, but it's created a certain perspective in me, and I think a wisdom, honestly. Because like I'll tell my story to young people about the history, for example, the case against Chevron, and I can't tell if people are getting demoralized or inspired sometimes, like because it's depressing.
yeah.
But it's also inspirational. And I think that I want to end my talks with people, and even in this podcast, to tell people like this work is very meaningful. Like, I've really enjoyed my life doing the work I've done, despite what was thrown at me. But maintain perspective. Like, you're simply, if your point is to improve the world and you're taking on powerful interests that are keeping people down and you're not getting attacked, you're probably not being very effective. So when you do this work, you people must understand going into it that getting attacked is actually a sign of your strength. It's a challenge.
It means you're a threat.
It means you're a threat. So one can be relatively happy doing this work even when you're dealing with a lot of challenges, because it's meaningful work and it matters and it creates for a very rich life and also rich relationships. Like, other people who do the work, there's an immediate connectivity, I find, immediate solidarity, and it's wonderful. I mean, it's the kind of thing money can never buy. Like, you're either in it or you're not. So, I want people to know, when I say the whole point of all this is so people can be happy, it's not like an end result so people can be happy, although I want conditions to exist such that people can truly find happiness and not have to be so stressed out. But the journey to get there can be a very happy journey.
Speaking of your journey,
yeah,
you were disbarred, you got your law license revoked, and now you're trying to get it back.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the campaign to get your law license back and how people can support it?
Sure. So, I again have been hit by Chevron. I'm the only lawyer to be disbarred without a hearing. I mean, it's basically a political persecution. So I haven't had my license now for 7 years after having won this huge case against Chevron. They disbarred me for political reasons. So I'm launching a major campaign in the United States and globally to pressure the New York bar to reinstate my law license.
Nice.
And I could use all the support I can get. I'm not shy about it. Like, we need support. I actually believe the only thing that's going to move the legal establishment to do the right thing in this case is the idea that the whole world is watching them. So, I plan to use my campaign to raise this issue, to raise the issue of the people of Ecuador. It's pretty shocking, isn't it, that a lawyer who, fought all these years to win this landmark judgment is the guy who loses his law license, when the lawyers who orchestrated this whole fraud against me are still practicing.
Yeah.
So I'm going to need help, and we have a website called freedonziger.com. Even though I don't have my ankle bracelet on anymore, I'm not fully free because I can't work. And for other reasons, I have great difficulty traveling, leaving the country. But it's at freedonziger.com. Go to the website. We also have a crowdfunding platform so we can pay fees to lawyers and others who are helping me and pay our campaign expenses, which is at chuffed.org.
I'll put links to all of that in the description below. So if you're watching and you want to support Stephen, you can go right there and help him out, because it'd be great to see you practicing law again, given the epic success you've had.
I appreciate
when you've been allowed to.
I appreciate that. And I just want to say also that I have a Substack if people want to check my work out. I write kind of long form articles. So you can find me
I'll
on
put that
Substack.
there as well.
Find me
Yeah.
on Substack too.
Well, Stephen, such an honor to talk to you. Thank you for your time.
I really enjoyed the
appreciate it.
conversation.
Me
Really
too.
good luck with your work. By the way, I'll say independent media people like you are the key to everything I'm talking about. You're a check on abuses of power. And given that the corporate media has fallen down so much, particularly under Trump, your role is even more vital than ever. So I salute you for doing this, man.
Thank you. Doing what I can.
Yeah.
I appreciate you joining me. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
To help Stephen get his law license back, please donate to his campaign on Chuffed. I've dropped a link in the episode description, in addition to links to his social media profiles where you can follow his work. To support Greenpeace USA in their ongoing and very important appeal against Energy Transfer, the oil pipeline company, sign their open letter, also linked below, and more importantly, just tell people about this because no one seems to know that it's happening. One of the best ways to do that is to share this episode with someone you think would like it. That remains the best way to support this show, in addition to subscribing to make sure you get future episodes. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Ciao.